Hello and welcome to this episode of Words Can Paint 1,000 Pictures. I'm your host Sam. This episode we're continuing with our series on Colombian literature, and today specifically we are talking about feminist Colombian literature and how over time forms of resistance against patriarchal norms have changed within this literature. Today we are very lucky to be joined by our guest Emily. Welcome Emily.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for coming. We're going to start with romantic literature. What can you tell us about resistance in 19th century literature?
Well, in this period, we start to see examples of critical feminist literature reach the mainstream. Bear in mind, romantic literature of the 19th century certainly favored differentiation of gender roles and very limited representations of women. So any novel that criticized the status quo that gained popularity was a huge step for not just feminism in Latin America, but global feminism. Generally, during this period, women were portrayed as angels, but of the domestic sphere exclusively, and were confined to the status. But examples such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and here in Colombia Soledad Acosta de Sampras Dolores began to go against the grain.
And in what way did these novels go against the grain?
Well, in Shelley's Frankenstein, she deeply criticized the ego-driven social isolation of the male characters, portraying them as deeply flawed. And in a similar way, Soledad Acosta takes a similar approach. If we look in the depth at the male characters of the novel, they are not the heroes of the novel, and in many ways are deeply inadequate. Pedro, despite being the narrator and the main male character for much of the book, is completely powerless to help Dolores, which is what typically happened in these kinds of novels. And Pedro is arguably the most honorable male character in the book. The love interest, Antonio, is shallow and makes no real effort to visit or stay in touch with Dolores. Pedro's father also doesn't visit her despite saying he would. No male character is admirable in this book, and that is something unconventional for the time.
For sure. And given that, as Carolina Alzate says in her prologue for Dolores, literature wasn't separated from politics at this time, these messages during this period of nation building in a way teach, or at least propose, how the country should be. As such, these critical representations of the status quo are a good example of how literature can promote social change.
Certainly, I think resistance comes in the form of a different representation of women as well, resisting the typical stereotypes. Dolores has a lot of autonomy and her own story. She's very capable, very intelligent, and has a captivating personality in a literary world where many female characters were severely underwritten and one-dimensional. That being said, this is where Soledad Acosta is perhaps limited by her time. Despite being a big step for Latina feminist literature, it's still limited in its rebelliousness, let's say. Dolores, especially in the first part of the book, certainly fits within the stereotypes that the likes of Kirkpatrick talk about in their work. She's domestic woman, very much in connection with nature, and at the end of the book, despite being quite an unconvincing relationship, Dolores is written things like: No había rincón de mi choza, no había árbol o flor en mi jardín, ni estrella en el azul del cielo, ni pajarillo que trinara que no me dijera algo en nombre de él. There was no corn of my hut, no tree nor flower in my garden, no star in the blue sky, no chirping bird that did not say something to me on this behalf.
Yeah, she still feels dependent on his love for her own existence and her own identity, despite not having seen him in possibly years. It's noticeable that the novel is really a product of its own time, no?
Definitely.
Well, let's move on to the 20th century. How did resistance evolve in the literature of female Colombian writers?
I think a great example of a feminist critic of 20th century society can be in En diciembre llegaban las brisas by Marvela Moreno. Again, we have this representation of inadequate male characters. You know, Benito Suarez' initial charisma is quickly replaced by this selfish, exploitative, disloyal, nasty persona that dominates his characterization for much of the book.
Yeah, interesting. And when it comes to the female characters, there is a far broader representation of the female experience than we see in Dolores. Dora, with her oppressive marriage, trapped in a life that she's growing increasingly unhappy with throughout the novel. On the other hand, we see Beatriz, the rebellious cousin of Lena, who goes most against the patriarchal culture of the time, living life on her own terms. Also, families' expectations, particularly that of the male members of the family, fathers, brothers, cousins, they play a huge role in the book. Catalina conforms to these expectations, with the other side of the coin being Beatriz. But ultimately, what makes it such an effective critique of the oppressive society is how all of the central female characters end up miserable. It represents really the impossibility, or at least near impossibility, of finding happiness for these women. And because of the writing style being from Lena's perspective, yet not in the first person style, so as to avoid Lena becoming the focus of the novel and keeping that with the other three, we really follow their experiences deeply. We go on a journey through their unhappiness, and that really provides an emotional impact that captures the reader's empathy, makes them really think about the injustice of the world the novel depicts.
Yeah, I agree. I think the book is very effective at truly providing a comprehensive critique of the patriarchy that is so woven into the fabric of families, relationships, love, marriage, work, politics, everything.
Yeah. I think there's a really lovely passage at the end of the book in Lena's epilogue that encapsulates the contrast between what we've talked about in the suffering of these women and the beauty of the place in which it takes place. I think it really creates this bittersweet feeling within the reader. Los años han pasado y no he vuelto a Barranquilla, aquel lugar donde nuestras abuelas llegaron trayendo a lomo de mula, en un hervidero de polvo, sus muebles y añoranzas de las ciudades más antiguas del litoral Caribe. Ellas traían, recuerdo, montones de recuerdos. Nosotros las oíamos hablar de aquel mundo que fue el suyo, sin pensar en el nuestro, ligero y fácil, girando siempre en torno a la piscina de un club, a los bailes de carnaval. Entraría también en la nostalgia de la memoria. This contrast of nostalgia and painful memories is a far more emotionally impactful and accurate representation, I would think, of what many women in Colombia feel and can relate to, more so than in
Interestingly, this perspective is very similar to another book we are going to talk about, Primera Persona by Margarita Garcia Robayo. In her first short story, she also explores this idea of feeling conflicted about one's homeland in El Mar. She devotes this chapter to a profound reflection on the sea and its significance in her life, of course coming from Cartagena on the Caribbean coast of Colombia. The sea plays a central role in her childhood and is simultaneously portrayed as a place of freedom and fear, beauty and harshness.
Yeah, for example, it opens with the line, El primer recuerdo es molesto, el escozor de la sal en las heridas de infancia. The first memory is unpleasant, the sting of salt on childhood wounds. This idea of heridas de infancia, or childhood wounds, is exactly what Lena talks about in her epilogue in En diciembre llegaban las brisas. It's certain that Moreno was an important influence for Robayo. In this way, we see the impact of resistance in feminist writing, as well as reaching a general population and promoting important messaging. It also does the incredibly important work of inspiring future writers to continue this mission.
Yeah, and Garcia Robayo has certainly done that, particularly regarding the role of women. In El Mar, the sea is used as a metaphor for inner and outer conflicts. It stands for attraction and fear, freedom and restriction, and reflects the tensions that women experience in patriarchal society. She denounced the gender-specific restriction to which women are subjected. The insecurity conveyed by the sea is compared to the barriers that women experience due to traditional roles and patriarchal structures. By addressing these issues, she questions the power relations and systematic discrimination in her society of origin. The chapter itself becomes an act of resistance. Garcia Robayo resists patriarchal narratives by making the female experience visible and countering the stereotypical images of women as harmonious or passive. Instead, she shows the contradictions and tensions that characterize both the sea and the female identity. Her writing thus becomes a powerful statement for a self-determination against rigid social compositions.
And this expressiveness can be attributed to the entire book, as can also be seen in the chapter Amar al Padre, which is dedicated to an honest examination of her relationship with her father. She paints a portrait of a distant and contradictory man who is admired and criticised in equal measure. The author's memories of her father are composed of a mixture of affection and frustration, and reveal how this relationship shaped her understanding of family ties and authority. This reflection becomes a starting point to question the meaning of power and expectation within family structures.
Yes, she questions the patriarchal role models that heavily influence the relationship between father and daughter. The father appears as a dominant but at the same time unattainable and emotional distant figure, which has a lasting effect on the bond with the daughter. The author sheds light on how patriarchal structures create unrealistic expectations of women and how these often lead to emotional damage.
Yeah, and I think herein lies the development from Moreno's writing in the 1980s to Garcia Robayo's writing in 2017. Moreno certainly shows the effects of toxic patriarchal behaviour and societal structures and how they can ruin or at least worsen the lives of women in the novel. Meanwhile, Garcia Robayo goes into the why patriarchal tendencies within relationships are so damaging, and that is key. Identifying the issue within society is certainly important, and Moreno was a fantastic example of calling out this aspect. But I think Garcia Robayo goes further, explaining why it happens, and ultimately finding the why is how we eliminate it within our culture. I'd like to finish off with this passage from Amar al Padre. Hachi y yo reemplazamos la convivencia por los viajes y también era una mierda. Era horrible ir y venir, despedirse cada vez. También era horrible viajar juntos. Él tenía la necesidad irrefrenable de controlar el camino, de decidir itinerarios y de elegir aquello que mis ojos debían mirar. Él había viajado tanto y yo nada. Él podía enseñarme el mundo, su mundo, y su mundo me aburría demasiado. It illustrates how the patriarchy influences how we behave in the relationships we have in life, with our family, friends, or in this case, love interests, how it manifests itself and how it maintains itself. Él podía enseñarme el mundo, su mundo. It teaches itself to the younger generations. It's a fantastic warning from Garcia Robayo and an advert to call it out when this happens. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and thank you again to our expert Emily for joining.
Bye.
Until next time.